Alright, welcome to the Plea Bargain Project, Session 4, on the introductory lessons to the project. Before this video, in Part 3, we talked about establishing the project itself. In review, I wanted to be able to give you more clear examples, so you know moving forward what exactly you'll be doing. To do this, I'm actually going to pull up scenarios and their original forms and their final forms. To start, this is actually the rough draft of the Plea Bargain Project back in the day. You can kind of tell it's not the right format. It's named something really funny. It was actually very difficult to find this file because it wasn't properly cataloged. And it is pretty much all the things that I think is going to be in the scenario, but done in a way that that it can be given a review. So it's really important that you do these rough drafts, because I can tell you already, a lot of the things in this project a lot of things in this project were given approval. But just because they were given approval didn't mean we didn't have to go over them many times. We did. So this also helps you establish how you're going to set up your layers, which is an important thing we're reviewing today. So check this out. I have these files pretty simply done. In a larger file, it would be a little bit more complicated than just card changes. My untitled layer 1, which is my background layer, and my body. So in a background layer, you're obviously going to establish all the things that are stagnant. So the things that you don't have really changing. So that is what your first layer should be. And when you're doing a rough outline, you want this there so that you can establish how your figure is interacting with the world around it. And then you want to have things that are changing on a separate layer. That way that you can make clear, crisp animations that aren't really influenced by the fact that the background exists. And then you want, on top of that, a body. The body that is changing. In a regular animation, typically you can keep the body as one figure. Sometimes you can't. As we went over in sprites, you kind of have to separate the different parts of the body. But in the cutscenes, you can keep them all pretty much the same in one specific way. So in the first version of the project, we actually didn't draw the bald figure that I'm going to teach you how to draw. This is the line arted and colored version of the project that you just saw as a rough outline. Keep in mind, anything that's outside the box, you can just click this little handy button up here and it'll show you what you would actually see in the project when it renders out. Anything outside the box doesn't render, so it's okay if it looks a little sloppy. Except if you're going to have to resize it, which is why we always start 1920 by 1080, remember that. So this was the minimum viable product. And in this version, there was only one hairstyle, one eye color. There was no customization. So I actually created a figure that would end up being more complicated for me. Now, why is that? Well, because first off, you can notice here, the layers are not properly labeled. As I was working with nobody, I just kind of labeled it as I needed to, when in reality, you should never practice that. You should never think about the animation in terms of, well, I'm doing it by myself. Always organize and be clear, and just try and be as, document what the changes are if you feel you can't just sum it up in a layer. I ended up having a few layers for the background. The simpler you keep that, the better. The simpler you keep the background layers, the better. As always, the less layers, the easier it is. But when you're animating, you can't always do that. So, how is it that you should be animating, given that this looks like this? Well, the final form, this is after a different step of revisions was given, is a bald version of the avatar, correctly style matched and done, for the purpose of creating complicated animations. You make this figure bald, no matter what the presumed gender or the body type that we're going with. The figure always needs to be bald for the ease of adding on things. You also generally don't animate it with eyes, so you make this creepy figure who just has nothing going on except for their expression, except for the way their mouth moves. This also helps you get better at expressing without eyebrows, which belong to the eyes on the file. So, an important thing is always when you're doing the outlines. See, when I did the outlines, I did make a bald person, but because of the way the minimum viable product was done, I added hairstyles. I cannot stress enough that you need to separate hair and eyes. When you're exporting the files, they cannot be on the same layer, obviously, and you don't want to just have 6 versions of the figure. You want to be able to just click a layer and get rid of it. This is pretty basic, but it's a clear cut. You definitely need to do it this way. I wanted also to show you another example of a rough to a needs improvement version to a final version. So this is the security figure, the security footage, the first version. They were a little complicated. So we had this figure that was going to be the car that was going to be in our security footage. I did not know how to draw cars, and even in the rough you can kind of tell, what even is this car? What even is it doing? Well, ultimately, I spent more hours creating and working on this figure so that I could make a better security footage. And when you're thinking about your estimates and how long things are going to take you, you need to be upfront with your supervisors if you're not as good at drawing things. I actually got a project that I was uncomfortable with from the beginning. I've never been good at drawing cars, but it was just kind of understood. I said, you know what, it's going to be more difficult for me, but I'm going to use mirror tricks and I'm going to do whatever I can to make it happen. The security camera footage actually usually ends up being the most complicated footage that you work on. So when you're estimating how much a scenario and how long a scenario is going to take you, you definitely want to overestimate for the security footage because it is the most weird angle. It will probably take the most revisions given whatever your scenario is, and in general it's taken me and the other scenario creator the longest to work on the security footage just because of the awkward angle that everything is at. But you can see that everything has a very clear revision process. Everything goes through lots of stages of revisions, and it's been no different with the actual cutscenes. And making sure things look correct and fit the hairstyles that we've done. Again, remember, establishing hair 1, hair 2, hair 3 is super important. You want to make sure it matches what we've already established in the project. And we just, we go from there, making sure that everything syncs up so that you're creating less work for the programmer to have to rewire where each asset goes to each different thing. So, the simplest thing to do when you're doing this is always try keep your layers as simple as possible. If you cannot do that, just organize very well. Now, there is another, there are examples. In scenario 2, we had all the files separate. We tried that out, and unfortunately when you do that, you accidentally end up creating a very, very large file. So this is what one scene looked like in my file. You don't want to have more than this. You don't want to try and create a file that is so much more content than this. You want it all to roughly be in the same layer and organize everything, even if you have different shots. I think that's where a big point of confusion can come in, is you're like, well, it's a different shot. Maybe I should just animate it differently. Don't do that. Keep them all in the same file unless you find, oh, see, look, found an error because of revision. So, always keep your files together. always make sure that you are creating your file as seamlessly and as small as possible. And when you're line arting, even after you've line arted the first time, submit for revisions. It's really important that you create a file that is your exclusion file, or rather, it's really important that you create a file that is your published version that the programmer can see and edit, and then a version you can see and edit. And it might help you to have a version you can see and edit, and to review it first, because if you're just submitting your project, if you're just submitting your final video or your final published file without having reviewed it yourself to make sure that you exported it correctly, you can't check a published file, but you can check a file you exported or rendered out. So always make sure to double check your files, submit them for review if you can, because you don't want little mistakes like this where you don't have the eyebrows on one seat, which I think is solely because let's see, just one eye didn't happen to have eyebrows in that scene. So you always have to double check, make sure you turn off all your layers, and make sure you export and render before you publish. And we're going to go over next how you publish every file, but for now, keep in mind the state of revision, rough draft, line art stage. Then you can color by using this handy dandy tool over here, which I actually think you cannot see. There we go. This handy dandy tool. And then on top of that, you submit for revision, and you try and find all your mistakes. Use research to create a proper version of your file. And when you find, this is a better title, Security Footage Scenario 1, but car rough, what does that mean? So we're going to retitle Scenario 1, Security Footage Rough Draft. You want names like that, where everything is clear and everything is concise. And moving on, we can learn just exactly what you want all of that to have.